On the morning of May 29, 1453, a young man named Mehmed II rode a white horse through a shattered gate in the western wall of a dying city. He was 21 years old. The city he entered had stood as the capital of the Roman Empire for 1,123 years. By sunset, it would belong to him, and the world that surrounded the Mediterranean Sea would never operate the same way again. The fall of Constantinople is one of those events that history textbooks treat as a single line, a single date. But the date itself is the least interesting part. What matters is the chain of decisions, technological inventions, demographic shifts, and political miscalculations that made it possible. And what matters even more is what flowed out of the broken city in the months and decades after. Refugees carrying Greek manuscripts closed trade routes that pushed Europeans into the Atlantic. A new imperial model that would dominate 3 continents for 400 years. Let's walk through how a 1,000-year empire ended in 53 days. First, the level set, because you cannot understand the conquest without understanding the corpse. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire was not really an empire anymore. It was a city with suburbs. At its peak, around the year 555, under Justinian, Constantinople had ruled the entire eastern Mediterranean basin, Egypt, North Africa, the Levant, Anatolia, the Balkans, southern Italy. By 1453, that empire had shrunk to the city itself, a few patches of the Peloponnese in southern Greece, and a stretch of coastline along the Black Sea. Population estimates for Constantinople in its final year run between 40,000 and 50,000 people. At its peak, it had held nearly 500,000. How did a city collapse like that? 4 overlapping disasters stacked across roughly 250 years. 1. The Great Schism of 1054 split Latin Christianity from Greek Christianity, which meant that when the Byzantines needed help against rising Turkic powers, the Catholic West was not eager to send it. 2. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 was supposed to attack Egypt. Instead, the Venetian-led crusaders sacked Constantinople itself, burned half the city, hauled off its bronze horses to Venice, and installed a Latin emperor on the throne. The Byzantines clawed the city back in 1261. But the city they recovered was a hollow shell. 3. The Black Death arrived in 1347 and killed somewhere between 1/3 and half the population. And 4. While Byzantium was reeling from each of these blows, a new power was consolidating across the strait in Anatolia. The Ottoman Turks, beginning around 1299, started as a small frontier emirate in northwest Anatolia. Within 150 years, they had absorbed every other Turkic emirate, crossed into Europe, captured Adrianople, conquered Bulgaria, defeated the Serbs at Kosovo in 1389, and pushed Byzantine territory back to almost nothing. By 1453, the city of Constantinople was an island in an Ottoman sea. Now, here is the question the Byzantines could not answer. Why hadn't the Ottomans already taken Constantinople? The walls. The land walls of Constantinople were the most formidable fortifications in the world, built in the 5th century under Emperor Theodosius II. They consisted of a deep outer ditch, a low outer wall, a terrace, and then a massive inner wall studded with 96 towers. These walls had repelled the Avars, the Arabs, the Bulgarians, the Rus, and the Ottomans themselves on multiple prior attempts. They had not fallen to an attacking army in 1,000 years. Now we get to the person and the technology. Mehmed II became Sultan in 1451 at the age of 19. His father, Murad II, was a respected ruler who had twice tried to take Constantinople and twice been frustrated. Mehmed inherited a stable empire, a competent army, and a personal obsession that would have struck most contemporaries as unrealistic. He was going to take the city. Western diplomats who met him in his early years described him as quiet, intellectually curious, fluent in 5 or 6 languages, and unnervingly patient. Mehmed understood something his predecessors had not. The walls of Constantinople were not a problem you could solve with more soldiers or more siege ladders. They were a problem you had to solve with a new technology. And that technology in 1453 was the cast bronze siege cannon. Gunpowder had reached the Mediterranean from China by way of the Islamic world around 200 years earlier. By the early 1400 seconds, bronze and iron cannons were being cast across Europe and the Ottoman lands, but they were small, unreliable, and not particularly effective against thick stone walls. In 1452, a Hungarian engineer named Orban offered his services to the Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, proposing to build a cannon larger than any yet made. Constantine could not afford his asking price. Orban walked east to the Ottoman court. Mehmed paid him 4 times what he had asked for. What Orban built at the Ottoman foundry in Edirne over the winter of 1452 to 1453 was the largest cannon the world had yet seen. 27 feet long, a bore of 30 inches across, capable of firing a stone ball weighing roughly 1,300 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 400 men to drag it from Edirne to the walls of Constantinople, a journey of 140 miles that took 6 weeks. It could only be fired roughly 3 times a day because the barrel had to cool to avoid bursting. But when it hit a section of 5th century wall, the wall came down. This is the lesson that every empire eventually learns and almost never wants to. Defensive technologies that worked for 1,000 years can be obsoleted by a single offensive innovation in the span of weeks. The walls of Constantinople had been the immovable fact at the center of Mediterranean geopolitics. By April of 1453, they were a problem with a known solution. The siege began on the 6th of April, 1453, the Ottoman army outside the walls, numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, plus perhaps another 20,000 auxiliaries and laborers. Inside the walls, Emperor Constantine Shi could muster roughly 7,000 defenders, of which only about 5,000 were Greek. The remainder were Italian, mostly Venetian and Genoese mercenaries and crews, led by a Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani. Mehmed's plan had 3 components. First, the cannons would smash the land walls. Second, infantry assaults would pour into the breaches. Third, the Ottoman fleet would cut off resupply from the sea. All 3 components hit problems. Problem 1. The walls did not collapse as quickly as expected. When Orban's cannon and the dozens of smaller cannons in the Ottoman line opened the breach, the Byzantine defenders worked through the night, every night packing the gap with rubble, earth, barrels, and timber. The makeshift repairs absorbed cannon impacts better than the original stone had. For 4 weeks, the Ottomans would smash a breach by day and find it sealed by morning. Problem 2. The naval blockade leaped. On the 20th of April, 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese and 1 Byzantine, fought their way through the Ottoman fleet and into the safety of the Golden Horn, the harbor on the northern side of the city. Mehmed, who had been watching from the shore, rode his horse into the surf in fury. He sacked his fleet admiral. And then he made a decision that turned the siege. On the night of the 22nd of April, the Ottomans hauled roughly 70 ships overland, across a ridge of hills behind the Genoese suburb of Pera, on greased wooden rollers and inclined wooden tracks built by Ottoman engineers in a few days. When the Byzantines woke up on the morning of the 23rd of April, an Ottoman fleet was floating inside the Golden Horn behind the great defensive chain that supposedly sealed the harbor. The defenders now had to spread their already thin garrison along the sea walls of the Horn, as well as the land walls. They could no longer concentrate. By the 3rd week of May, the situation inside the city had become desperate. Food was running low. The Venetian and Genoese crews were quarreling over command. Emperor Constantine sent envoys to Mehmed, offering to pay any tribute, sign any treaty, surrender any territory if the Ottomans would lift the siege. Mehmed offered Constantine safe conduct to the Peloponnese in exchange for the city. Constantine refused. He told the envoys that to leave the city would mean to give up the city and to give up the city was something no Roman emperor could do. He prepared for the final assault. The final assault came in 3 waves before dawn on May 29th, 1453. The first wave was made up of irregular troops, the Bashi-Bazuks, lightly armored, motivated by promised plunder, sent forward to absorb arrow fire and exhaust the defenders. They were thrown back after 2 hours of brutal fighting at the breaches near the central section of the walls called the Mesotychin. The second wave was Anatolian regulars, better armored, better trained, fighting more methodically. They came closer to breaking through, but were also repelled by Justinian's Genos troops, who had concentrated at the most damaged stretches of the wall. The third wave was the Janissaries. These were the elite of the Ottoman army, originally recruited as boys from Christian villages in the Balkans through a system called Defsherm, converted to Islam, trained from childhood as soldiers and bureaucrats, paid directly by the Sultan sworn to him personally. They were professionals fighting beside an inspired sovereign. The Genoese and Greeks had been fighting for 7 weeks with no relief and no sleep. 2 events broke the defense within the same hour. First, Giovanni Giustiniani was wounded by a gunshot or crossbow bolt. The sources differ. His Genoese troops, seeing their commander carried off the wall, began to waver and then to retreat through a postern gate toward the harbor. At nearly the same moment, a smaller postern gate, called the Kerkoporta, was found to have been left unlocked, or perhaps inadequately defended. A small Janissary detachment poured through. They raised an Ottoman banner on a tower inside the inner wall. The cry went up among the defenders: "The city is taken." Constantine Shi, the last Roman emperor, stripped off his imperial insignia, drew his sword, and charged into the closest mass of attacking Janissaries. He was killed in the fighting. His body was never reliably identified. The empire of Augustus, of Constantine the Great, of Justinian, of Heraclius, of Basil II, ended in an unmarked corpse in a rubble breach at the western edge of the city. The city fell on May 29th. Mehmed granted his troops the customary 3 days of plunder, then ordered the looting to stop on May 31st. He entered Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of the Eastern Roman Church, and ordered it converted into a mosque. He took the title Kaiser, I Rome Caesar of Rome, and he meant it. Now, what flowed out of that city in the days, months, and decades after the conquest? That is where the long causal chain begins. 4 downstream consequences shaped the next 5 centuries. Consequence 1, the Renaissance accelerated. In the years before the conquest, and especially in its aftermath, Greek scholars, philosophers, and copyists fled west, carrying with them manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and the entire corpus of classical Greek literature, much of which had been preserved in Constantinople, but only sparingly available in the Latin West. These refugees settled in Florence, Venice, Rome, and Naples. They taught Greek in the universities. They sold their manuscripts to humanist book collectors, like Cosimo de' Medici. The flowering of Renaissance humanism in the second half of the 15th century is not entirely the result of this refugee transfer, but it is unimaginable without it. Consequence 2. The Mediterranean trade routes through the eastern Levant became expensive and politically unstable. The Ottomans now controlled the corridors between Europe and the Indian Ocean trade in spices, silk, and dyes. They taxed it heavily, and Italian merchants who had grown rich on the Levantine routes saw their margins compress. European traders and the kings who funded them began asking the same question with increasing urgency: is there a way to reach Asia by sea, going around the Ottoman world entirely? Portuguese expeditions had already begun probing down the West African coast. After 1453, the pressure to find an alternative route to the Indies became overwhelming. Within 50 years of the fall of Constantinople, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama reached India by sea, and Christopher Columbus, searching for a westward route, made landfall in the Caribbean. None of these voyages was caused only by the Ottoman conquest, but all of them were powerfully motivated by the new costs of the Mediterranean alternative. The Age of Discovery was, in part, a workaround. Consequence 3. A new imperial template Mehmed II did not merely conquer Constantinople, he reorganized it, he repopulated it with Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Muslims from across his empire. He introduced the millet system, under which non-Muslim religious communities governed their own internal affairs under their own clerics, paying a special tax. This system, refined by Mehmed's successors, allowed the Ottoman Empire to govern an enormous, multi-religious, multi-ethnic territory with relatively low administrative cost for nearly 4 centuries. It also planted the seeds of 19th and 20th century nationalism because each religious community retained an internal coherence that could later become a national identity. Consequence 4. Russia became Russia. In 1472, the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III, married Sophia Paleologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. She brought to Moscow the symbols, ceremonies, and theological claims of the fallen empire. By the early 16th century, Russian clerics were calling Moscow the Third Rome. Rome had fallen to the barbarians, Constantinople had fallen to the Turks, and Moscow remained as the last seat of true Christian imperial authority. The imperial ideology of Russia, from the Tsar's double-headed eagle to the Russian Church's claim of leadership over Orthodox Christianity, traces directly back to the rubble of 1453. So pull back. What does this episode of history actually teach us? First, old institutions die slowly and then suddenly. The Byzantine Empire was in practical terms dead for 200 years before 1453. It survived on inertia, on prestige, on the simple fact that its walls had not yet been breached. When the right technology arrived in the hands of the right adversary, the inertia collapsed in 53 days. Second, technological inflection points propagate faster than political imagination can keep up with. Constantine Shi knew about gunpowder. He even had a chance to hire Orban. He could not raise the price. A new technology in the hands of an adversary is not just a tactical threat. It is a strategic catastrophe. And it almost always arrives faster and at higher capability than the incumbent expects. Third, the end of a polity is not the end of its ideas. The Byzantine Empire died, but its laws shaped the legal codes of every successor state from the Balkans to the Caucasus. Its religion spread north into Russia and outlived the empire by half a millennium. Its manuscripts seeded the European Renaissance. Its administrative model influenced the Ottomans who replaced it. Empires fall. The information they contain does not necessarily fall with them. It diffuses. On May 29, 1453, a young sultan rode through a broken gate into a dying city. By the 1st of June, the looting was over and the conversion of Hagia Sophia had begun. By the end of the century, Portuguese ships were docking in India and Spanish ships were arriving in the Americas, in part because the cheap route through the eastern Mediterranean had been closed off. By the early 16th century, the Tsar of Russia was claiming Moscow as the Third Rome. By 1683, the Ottomans had advanced as far as the walls of Vienna before being thrown back in turn. The walls of Theodosius are still there. You can walk along them today. They run for 14 kilometers across the western edge of the modern city, half ruined, half restored, with grass growing between the stones. They are a useful reminder that the things which feel permanent in your own time, the institutions, the technologies, the strategic facts, are usually less permanent than they look. And the events that change everything tend to happen quickly, often by lunchtime, after a long quiet morning when nobody quite believed the walls would actually fall. If you want more episodes that walk through the full causal chain behind events you only half remember from a textbook, subscribe. There is a lot of history to explain